All right. Sorry to shut off the party. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I believe it's fine for me to speak for my good colleague today, Diane, and say that we are absolutely delighted to join you all today and learn with all of you. And just to start, a quick logistical thing. You'll see on my slides here that, there's a URL and a code. So if you, our slides are interactive today, and this is a tool that allows you to submit responses to discussion posts and whatnot. I recommend that you open it up on your phone if you have it available, and you look at it there, or you can open a new tab in your browser as well. But go to menti.com and then enter the code at the top of the screen, 6529820. And just so we know that you were able to get into the Menti slides successfully, you can select one of the icons at the bottom of the slide and let us know you're in. I definitely recommend the cat. I like to reinforce librarian stereotypes wherever I can. So I love that icon, Menti, thank you. With that, a little bit of context for this workshop, just briefly. The previous version of this workshop was run about, 4 years ago at this point as a full day event, which means that we're cutting something down that should probably have been a week anyway. So not to worry, we'll be sharing all of our materials and the recording. But it will be fast-paced, and honestly, I think we're not going to be modeling as much as we would like how you should be teaching. It's really important to plan your sessions with enough time for questions and discussions. So we just want to acknowledge that there will be moments where we're not doing that. And with all of that said, let's just recognize that it's still a pandemic. Many of us have daycare issues, other things going on. Work is crazy right now. So please take care of yourselves and do whatever you need to do during this session to do that. Take breaks whenever you want. That's all perfectly fine by us. So my name is Megan Bresnahan. I am the Life Sciences and Agriculture Librarian at the University of New Hampshire. I graduated from the University of Michigan's iSchool in 2007 and have worked in a variety of STEM liaison positions throughout my career. I recently also finished my master's in education, and that was from my current institution. And I am also a very proud first-generation college student, but I will admit that I had to learn to be proud of that aspect of my identity.
Thank you.
And I share that too, that it, that's something that I bring with me to my practice of librarianship and my philosophies around librarianship. So I'll let Diane introduce herself.
Hey all, my name is Diane Brown. I am the Research and Instructional Design Librarian at the Gutman Library at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I didn't plan a beautiful introduction like Megan, unfortunately, so I'm a little bit on my feet here, but I just want to say thank you so much to the organizers of the symposium for inviting us. Megan and I were former colleagues, and we've become collaborators and friends, and it's been such a pleasure to work with her on this work. And I'm very excited to be working with all of you today and hopefully helping you build your confidence in teaching and just covering some really great content. So thanks so much for having us.
So Diane and I work on the unceded lands of the Massachusetts, Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples. She and I talked a little bit about how to handle the land acknowledgement as part of this presentation in a way that it can be meaningful to you all. So instead of taking the time to read the full versions of each of our university's land acknowledgements, I thought I'd take a moment to share some relevant resources. So the data that you see on the slide here, this is from High Country News, which is a Colorado-based newspaper that covers issues relevant to Indigenous nations and communities that are located within the Western US. The paper did an investigative report, I believe a year or two ago, on how land-grant universities have profited from the sale of stolen Indigenous lands through the Morrill Act in the 1860s. So on the slide here is the data from my institution, the University of New Hampshire. And I'll just note that the University of New Hampshire used to be located where Dartmouth College is now until the university sold the land that they acquired through the Morrill Act. And they used that money to create the campus where I currently work in Durham, New Hampshire. So my university was almost entirely founded on the profits of unceded land. So I encourage you to look up your institution, or if you're not at a land grant institution, look up universities in your state to learn more. And I'll just paste into the chat here.
Oh, I beat you to it. Yep, I got you.
And also we wanted to share a couple of recommended resources to learn more about Indigenous practices in teaching and research. We have a bibliography and Zotero library to share with you, and these books are included in that, so you don't need to frantically write those down right now. So I'll pass it off now to Diane to hear about what to expect today.
All right, thanks so much, Megan. So I'm going to pop this link to our bit.ly in the chat so that you have it as well as it's on the screen. This is where you're going to find our workshop materials for today. So there's an agenda, which we're going to do our best to stick to the timing of. So don't hold us too close to it. We're going to try our best. A workbook for today that I'd encourage you to download onto your machine so that you have access and space to work through the content together today. Our PDF version of the recommended readings and a link to the Zotero full version of those, and later after the workshop, our slides will be posted there as well. So if you have to hop off early, as long as you have this URL, you will have all the content. And again, Angela's recording the session, so you'll be able to get access to that later. Just a quick note that the second B in bit.ly there does need to be capitalized for you to get access to the content. So don't forget that second capital B. All right, Megan, I think we're ready for the next slide. Thank you. So here is our very like packed agenda today. Again, like we have timing in the agenda that's in your workshop materials. We're gonna do our very best to stick to this. We're talking briefly about your teaching philosophies. We're gonna frame how we do some lesson planning. We're talking about the ACRL frameworks. We're gonna review learning outcomes, active learning, critical pedagogy, assessment, classroom management, and reflection, right? So this is a speed run through all of these topics. And again, don't forget that you're gonna have all the materials later. So when you have time and space to breathe, after this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, it will be there for your reference. So don't panic. We're just going to like ride the wave together. Megan, next slide. These are our learning outcomes, which you have seen when you signed up for the workshop. At the end of this workshop, our participants will develop confidence as educators by discussing classroom management strategies and exploring their teacher identity. They will design a lesson plan with learning outcomes and assessment, and they will investigate active learning strategies for developing data literacy. So again, this, I think we did modeling well, right? We're trying to model some good learning outcomes here for you. And I think that's what we'll be headed in the next few slides. So next slide, please. Before you got in this room today, we asked you to draft some teaching philosophies. We gave you homework. So I think maybe that already set the tone that we expect some engagement and excitement and participation today. And so I hope that you had time to do that. And in your workbook, right in that first section of your workbook, there is a place for you to paste that teaching philosophy. I think it's nice to have it at the top of mind as we're working through the rest of the content today. So Megan, next slide, please. So what is a teaching philosophy, right? A teaching philosophy is a self-reflective statement of your beliefs about teaching and about learning. And I think my sort of subtitle to this is that it's not something that's set in amber or in stone, right? My teaching philosophy has changed as I'm learned from other teachers, as I've read theory and engaged in practice and thought about what's important to me in the classroom and what's important to my students in the classroom. But I think it's nice to have this kind of guiding star that we can hold true as we are teachers, especially working in the library context, right? So much of our work is outside of our control, and my classroom is a space where I get to set the tone and I get to provide an experience for my students that rings true to me and rings true to them. It's also an opportunity to think about the aspects of your identity that you need to consider in your classroom and the power dynamics of working in a classroom space. So Megan very kindly disclosed to us that she's a first-gen college student. I'm also a graduate from first-gen, and that means something to me as a teacher, and it impacts how I work with my students and how I structure my lessons, how I think through my classroom. So I think this is something that you'll want to just keep in the mind as we're working through our content today, and then maybe at the end, right after we've learned all all these different strategies and assessments and how to rate learning outcomes, take a minute to look back to that and think, what might I change now at the end of the day today? What might I change in 3 months? What might I change in a year of teaching and developing my practice? And be able to hold those things true for yourself and for the students in your classroom. So I think we're ready for the next slide. Yeah, thanks, Megan. Turn it over to you.
All right, so we're not going to spend a lot of time right now talking about lesson planning, but throughout the course of this workshop today, you're basically going to build pieces of a lesson plan that you'll assemble at the end. But we are providing you with a lesson plan template that I use in my teaching. It's in the bit.ly, the Google folder that we've already shared with you, so you can find that there. There's a screenshot of it here and a list of the components that are included within the template on the other side of the slide. But mostly the way that you should think about this is like a sort of a general outline of what you might to collect to prepare for your teaching. And I'll be honest, my lesson plans vary in their degree of detail depending on how busy I am in the semester. But it's just, I think, a very important teaching practice to get into, to always develop a lesson plan. And also it's sort of like a metadata where you will thank yourself later. When you teach classes, sometimes the same class, once a year, my brain works in a way that it's a clean slate next year and I remember nothing. And so it can be a great guide to reuse and then improve the teaching components that you already built previously for a session. So a little bit about the ACRL Framework for Information Literacy in Higher Education. So we were thinking a little bit about the application of the framework to data visualization and how instruction in data literacy and visualization, we would guess, often involves learning tools, specific tools and skills that may align more obviously with how the sunsetted ACRL information literacy standards were designed. So with that, we wanted to spend a little time thinking about how to create a bridge between data visualization literacies and the framework. So this leads us into our first activity. What we're going to do is break you out into groups, and there will be 6 groups, and each group is going to look at one of the frames. And you will be expected to share your takeaways, but there's a Google Doc here. Move it, stick in there. That this is linked in your workbook too, so you should be able to link right from here, but there's a direct link. And what we'd like you to do is go to that copy of the framework and just have at it. Like, you can comment, you can highlight, just collaboratively point to ways that where you see intersections between the framework and data literacy or data visualization literacy more specifically, and to your work. And we have about, I believe, 10 minutes for this activity, but we'd like you to be prepared to share some takeaways when you come back. So I'm going to stop my share.
I have 6 breakout rooms ready. Megan, should I send them?
Yep, send them. Thank you, Diane.
Okay, here you go.
Okay, great. So it looks like everybody's popping back in. So this is your first prompt in the Menti. So if you want to go ahead and open up, either if you put the Menti on your phone or in your browser, and your first question is, please share 1 to 2 takeaways about the frame that you examined and how it relates to data. And since there's 6 frames, if you could just sort of note which one it is at the front of it so we can tell, we could probably guess, but that would be helpful as well. So I'll just give you a minute to do that. Please speak up or type in chat if you have any trouble figuring the Menti interface out.
We should add, for folks who haven't used Menti before, your responses will pop up live on the screen here so that we all can see what it'll be anonymous. Of course, we don't know who's putting what, but we'll be able to see what folks' takeaways are. So it's a cool tool to be able to let you participate without having to feel nervous that you're unmuting and talking in front of 30 of your new best friends. Ooh, crediting code, yes. The message of authority without being authoritative.
I love the point about the disciplinary variations as well.
Yes, the data is not inclusive, right? Somebody had to select that data, what they collected, and what does that mean for our visualizations at the end? Let's give you one more minute to put your final thoughts, and unfortunately, we got to cruise on with the rest of our content. Oh, awesome resource, Emma. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and please be encouraged to also pop stuff in the Zoom chat. If there's stuff you come across you want to share with folks or that seems relevant, definitely feel free to use that chat as well.
Anyone dying to share something about their takeaway? We have a minute to do so. These are all really good.
And we'll also add that the Menti responses will be saved as part of the PDF slide deck, and we'll put it on the workshop materials at the end of the presentation. So you'll get access to all of your colleagues' responses and the content that we've created for you. So don't worry, this will all be captured. Yeah, Ellie, right? We want to make sure we can save the beautiful things. The beautiful things will be there for you at the end, we promise. All right, Megan, I think we gotta cruise on.
Okay, so I just wanted to share, this is a book that came out this past year, Data Literacy in Academic Libraries, Thinking Critically with Numbers. And it sort of, the final chapter of the book written by the editor, Julia Botter, points out the similarities between evaluating textual information and evaluating data. And in the chart that's on the screen here, which is from that chapter, sort of applies the frames to questions that you might use or prompt students to use to evaluate data. So I wanted to share that. It's a really great book, and I'm glad I got my hands on it. Also, this graphic, as you know, was presented on Wednesday as part of the symposium's project report. And Diane and I love this. This is so awesome. It's clear that the fellows have already been deeply engaged with the ACRL framework and even have started to really push beyond that and thinking about unique data literacies and sort of critical data literacy in particular. So this is really great.
All right, awesome. So we're going to start getting into some of the nuts and bolts of building a lesson plan and thinking through our teaching. And so my plan is to give you just a little bite of education theory, and then we're going to move right into practice stuff. So I think the little bite helps us understand the practice a little bit better. So we're going to talk about writing learning outcomes. And back in the 1980s, two guys, Wiggins and McTeague, wrote this book called Understanding by Design, which has become like a foundational text in education theory and practice. And the big takeaway from their book is this idea of backwards design. And that's the theory that we're going to be working with today. And backwards design is that we want to make sure we figure out what we want our students to do and know at the end of our session before we get wrapped up in designing a cool activity and fun things and using the technology tools, right? We want to make sure we know where they're going at the end, and then we have to figure out how we get them there. And I think this is particularly important for us working in libraries and us working with technology tools, is because there's like so much cool and fun stuff that we can do in the classroom. We want to be engaged, and we know that sometimes library work can be a little boring, right? We're not the top of our students' mind when it comes to exciting things to engage in. So we can get really caught up in the idea of like, I want to use this super fun tool, and we lose the thread a little bit about why our students are there and what they need to be able to do at the end of our session. So backwards design encourages us to think about where we're trying to get to, what's the goalpost, and then we're going to go back and figure out how we're going to get students there. So next slide, please, Megan. So these are 3 things we want to keep in mind when we're writing our learning outcomes, right? Our learning outcomes should be narrow. Our learning outcomes should be measurable. And our learning outcomes should start with an action verb. So we'll review these in a minute. So this is a great example of a learning outcome that Megan has provided for us. So at the end of this workshop, students will be able to identify the structure of a randomized control trial as represented in the biomedical literature. So right off the bat, narrow, right? That signal phrase at the beginning, at the end of this workshop, students will be able to burn that into your memories, right? Like hold that close to your heart. That's all your learning outcomes should start with. At the end of this workshop, students will be able to, right? Because we're not trying to assess broadly that students will be able to know the full scope of research or understand in depth how to use every data visualization tool or it's too big, right? So we're focused on what are they going to be able to do at the end of our particular time with them, whether that's 15 minutes, whether that's 45 minutes, whether that's an hour and a half. Our learning outcomes should be measurable. And this is where that sort of verbiage becomes really important. So in my notes here, I have beware of understand. We always want to use understand. At the end of this workshop, students will be able to understand A, B, C, or D. But like, what does understand mean? Like, what is understanding, and how can we measure understanding? And what does understanding mean to you versus what it means to me, right? Understanding can be like a tricky, squishy, fallible word. We're going to move away from understand. I'm going to give you some great examples of words that are not understand that we'll use later. But we want to think about how can we measure whether the students learned the thing we said we'd have them learn at the end, or if they didn't, right? That's what measurable means. And then that action verb, we're going to get back into those action verbs in just a little bit. And I'll give you some great examples of verbs we can use in lieu of students will be able to understand. So hold that close to your heart. At the end of this workshop, students will be able to, and then we figure it out what we're going to have them do and what the goal of the session is. So next slide, please, Megan. So a few key questions to keep in mind as we're setting our learning outcomes. What are we being asked to teach, right? What do folks want us to teach? What's our workshop going to be about? Who are our students? Who's the audience? What level of understanding might they have already? Are they coming to us fresh? Are they upper level university students? Are they public school students that we're meeting with for the first time? How much time do I have, right? That narrow piece is really, really important. I think about if I'm going to go teach a library orientation and I've gotten 15 minutes, I'm not going to say that students will be able to understand how to use the depth of research tools because I've got 15 minutes. My goal is students will be able to identify who their program liaison is, right? I want them to know that it's me, and that's what I can do in 15 minutes. And lastly, how can I infuse critical data concepts into my learning outcomes and therefore into my lesson? And Megan's going to talk in the second half of this workshop deeply about critical pedagogies and how they apply to data work. So preview of coming attractions, there's more to come there. So next slide, please. So this chart is my go-to chart for writing my learning outcomes. This is Bloom's taxonomy. So Benjamin Bloom created this with an education committee in the 1950s, and then it was revised in 2001 to update the language a little bit. And the committee's goal was to help us sort of name and also quantify what we're asking of students. And it also provides consistency and clarity for educators across different school districts, around different schools and in different levels of education, right? So before people were writing learning outcomes, there wasn't a standard agreement on the language that we use to help us understand what level of student learning we were trying to engage in. So this commission helped create this taxonomy to help us identify those different pieces. It's laid out as a pyramid here, which I find really helpful because the bottom of the pyramid is that foundational stuff, right? When I'm first learning something, I need to be able to remember it. That's why I can easily identify something, recall it, and tell you what it's about. And then all the way up to create, right? I've learned enough knowledge that now I can create something of my own based on my own data, right? Based on my own research skills. And that's a bigger cognitive lift than me just being able to identify something at the bottom of the pyramid. On the right side here, you'll see these beautiful verbs that help us write those really good learning outcomes. So instead of using something like students will be able to understand, I can say at the end of this workshop, students will be able to describe the best practices for file naming strategies to store their data, right? And then if I wanted to measure that, ostensibly, I could do a little quiz and have an open text box and say, please describe the 3 principles in storing your file names for your appropriate data usage, right? So right, Megan has tape to the wall. So it's a really good way to be able to match, like, what am I trying to get students to do? How might I be able to measure it at the end? And then how am I going to get them there, right? That's we're thinking about these learning outcomes. And we have no understanding, right? There's no understanding here. It's too squishy of a verb. What I have found, the only thing I think the drawback is here, right, is that some folks think that if I'm teaching using things in the understand row or the remember row, that maybe I'm not doing as good of a job, right? Or my students aren't learning as much as folks who are in the apply and the analyze and the evaluate rows. And I just want to remind us all that we came into this world completely fresh, right? We had to learn all kinds of things to talk and to ride a bicycle and how to engage in all kinds of things that we do now, and we needed to learn the basics before we could get up to those apply things. So we had to be able to identify an apple before we could eat an apple and before we could grow an apple tree, right? So don't worry that you're doing it wrong or you're not doing your students justice if you're teaching the foundations. The foundations are critical to giving your students what they need to be successful as they move up that Bloom's pyramid. So none of this is a value judgment. It's just an objective way to understand what do my students need and how am I going to get them there by the end of my session. So next slide, please. We'd love for you to take a few minutes to identify some learning outcomes that you may use either in a future data visualization workshop or think about something that you've taught in the past that we may want to revisit and revise. This is a great opportunity, whichever works best for you. In your workbook, you'll see a space to draft some learning outcomes. We've popped our beautiful Bloom's taxonomy pyramid in there, so you have all that verbiage. There's a little matrix to help you think through what I want students to do, what Bloom's verbs might I use, what framework might I tie this to. Whichever pieces of that was useful for you, please use. There's space to write 3. We don't need you to write 3, right? If you write just 1, that's fine. It's all up to you depending on how long your lesson is and how much time and engagement you'll have to pull that together. So don't feel constrained by what we have given you for options there. Whatever works best for you, it works best for you. So we're going to ask folks to mute their videos if you haven't already. This is going to be a solo work time. We're just going to keep the room quiet, and let's take about 5 to 7 minutes to draft a couple of learning outcomes. I'm going to mute now too, so it's just going to be a quiet room for you all to work. All right, so our Menti is live. Same code, same site as before. We would love to see your favorite learning outcomes in our Menti for your colleagues to see and for us to see. We're not judging anybody's learning outcomes. It's just an opportunity again to share information amongst yourselves and with one another to learn from what other people are thinking about. So please go ahead and put your favorite learning outcome in the Menti now. Ooh, these are so good. I love an identify too, right? In terms of assessment, identify is like chef's kiss. It's so good. Awesome. Ooh, critique best practices. I love it. Evaluate and communicate. That's a nice one, a double. From any data set thrown at them. Yes, we have those critical skills to be able to identify and figure it out, whatever it is. It's great. Purposes of persuasion. Best vision. I want to attend all of these work. That's my takeaway. I would like to be able to attend all of these workshops. These are so fantastic. Common challenges. Yes. Data narratives.
And I think one thing that I've learned over time is you want to be careful not to jam too much into one learning outcome, and also don't have too many learning outcomes overall, because you're just setting yourself up, not to meet your own expectations. So less is more there too.
Yes. I always say time is a finite, precious resource. Right? We want to make use of it. And I think particularly for library folks, we have so much that we want to give to you in the 20 minutes that we can see you. We just want to, and maybe that's true of 2 librarians who have planned a workshop for you today that you're all in attendance of. We just want to give you so much that we've really just jam-packed the day. So yes, thank you, Ellie. That's great. So yes, right. Like sometimes less is more. Sometimes like just understanding our own time limitations and constraints can help us as we're thinking through these learning outcomes. These are beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing them with us. We know you can be vulnerable to share your materials even anonymously. So we very much appreciate you sharing this stuff with us and with your colleagues. I think it's so invaluable to see what other people are working on here. So Megan, I think we're ready to move on to the next section. Okay, so we've covered what our lesson plan template, right? Our guiding document for today. We've drafted some learning outcomes that we may want to use in our workshop. And the next steps, we know where we want students to get. So now we have to figure out how we're going to get them there. And your little bite-sized education theory before we jump into the practice for active learning and assessment is this idea of constructivism. So in my bio for this workshop today, you saw that I'm a constructivist educator. What does that mean? So essentially, constructivism is an educational theory that posits that we all have existing knowledge frameworks in our brains already, even from when we're little to when we're adults. We've already learned stuff, and that's stuff that we've learned in our formal education contexts and just in our lived experience. Right? We've all learned different lessons. We put those things together to develop these knowledge frameworks. As we intake new information, we have to either change our mental models or add to our existing mental models. So it's easy to add stuff to our existing mental frameworks, right? With that stuff, our scope of understanding, we already understand it. It's easy just to add stuff in there. It's trickier to have to adapt our mental models to add new things, right? And that's what when we see, I always think about when kids transition from like 2nd grade to 3rd grade, that's a big cognitive shift in the stuff they're being asked to do. And it's a big developmental stage for them. So if anybody knows kids or hangs out with kids frequently, you'll see like all of a sudden things get a little more challenging in 3rd grade because they're being asked to like push these mental models in a way that they have not been asked to expand them and build on them before. So that's the constructivist piece, right? We're constructing these new models as we're learning stuff. Constructivism also says that learning is an active and social experience. So we should be doing things, engaging with things, engaging with one another, whether that's our instructor or engaging with our peers and our colleagues. And it's personal and contextual. So there's like so many layers to this onion, right? So my learning is going to be different from Megan's learning, is going to be different from anybody else's learning. And what I learn is really dependent on the context in which I'm learning it. So if I'm working to study for a history test, I'm not only going to learn the important dates in the Civil War, I'm also learning about what a chronology is, right? So I'm learning about different types of learning as I'm doing it, right? And it's a lot to think about. And that's why it's tricky to expand these mental models, because our brains are doing so much work each time we're learning something. And so when we're engaging in active learning, we're also engaging in motivation around learning, and that's critical. So that means if we're not feeling engaged with the subject, if it's not tied to our lives or our work in some way, it's easy for us to like push it aside and say, oh, maybe not, it's not what I want to dig into right now. And that's where we get those kind of negative learning experiences where people don't feel excited as you are maybe about the content. And active learning bakes in that engagement, right? We're already from the start asking people to be social, asking them to be active, asking them to feel motivated, tying it to their previous experiences, tying it to their work and their lives. And so that's why it's such a keystone in creating an effective lesson, is by thinking about these active learning principles. So that's your bite-sized theory around constructivism. Megan, next slide, please. So here are some like broad strokes about what active learning is. Basically, active learning is doing anything besides passively sitting and listening. So right now, we're not doing that great of active learning in this very slide, because here I am just talking and you're listening. But you'll notice that Megan and I have built in opportunities for you to work independently, to work in a breakout room with some colleagues, to share your responses. So we have tried to build active learning in here. Active learning has our students apply, analyze, and evaluate. Throwback to our friend Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy, the thing that we're trying to teach. Active learning applies to different learning modalities and different learning abilities. So it allows us to give some space in our lessons for students who may need more support, or for students who are advanced and they've already are past what we're trying to teach. It allows you to build in some flexibility there so that everybody can engage in a way that makes sense for them, and allows them to be meaningful participants in the lesson. And I know there was all this talk about learning styles, and then we said throw out learning styles, that they're not really useful. But we know that differentiating our instruction, or applying different ways for people to intake information and respond back to us, just provides a much more engaging learning experience. So I'm not going to say that this applies to all learning styles, but it just gives us a way to think about thoughtfully how we're engaging with our content, and how we're presenting to students, and how we're asking students to engage with us. And the why of active learning is that really sitting and listening is boring. And I found in the pandemic, I have such a limited capacity to sit and listen anymore. My brain is fried. So active learning allows me to engage and create knowledge and stretch those mental models and dig into content in a way that feels more meaningful to me. So we're going to give you a couple of broad examples of different active learning strategies in the next couple slides. And then Megan is going to give you some concrete examples of ways she's applied active learning in the science classroom. So Megan, next slide, please. Our first example of active learning is discussion. And I wanted to start with discussion because I think this is really low-hanging fruit. And I think sometimes we hear, oh, active learning, we think we have to do something really fabulous and engaged and technologically based and super intense. It can be as simple as having a discussion, whether that's with the whole class, whether that's in small groups. It gives you an opportunity just to have people feel participatory, feel heard. And we'd encourage you that if you're going to do discussion as an active learning strategy, make sure that your questions are open-ended and encourage critical thinking and response, right? Nobody wants to be asked sort of these softball questions unless it's maybe it's 8:30 in the morning, everybody's tired. But ask the questions that allow students to really dig into the material, and again activate that prior knowledge that students have when they come to your classroom, regardless of what their background is, right? Everybody already is bringing something to the table, so being able to connect it to their work and to their lives and getting them engaged makes them feel like they're creating knowledge alongside you, and that again, classroom dynamic wise, that can be really nice. Next slide, please, Megan. Another example is think, pair, share. I use think, pair, share a lot because this, if we're thinking back to our constructivist friends, right, Piaget and Vygotsky and all those guys, this hits both the personal and the social aspects of learning. So when I'm doing a think, pair, share, I have students work individually for X amount of minutes, and I'm always upfront about how many minutes they have for each portion of the activity, right? I want you to think on your own, and then I want you to turn to a partner and talk about what you did with your partner. And then I'd like to have us as a group share out kind of what we learned, what strategies we used, and how did we figure out how this tool worked, and how do we understand if this visualization is a good one or a bad one? What clues did we see here in that particular thing that we were looking at? So you could have them brainstorming a difficult information need, playing around problem solving. Just make sure you're tying it to their work or their assignment that they're expected to do, or their personal lived context, right? If you know something about the group of the people that you'll be working with, this is a great way to hit, like I said, those personal and social cues, and it is very engaging for students. Folks like to have an opportunity to do a little independent work before they're asked to be social. So this is a nice way to meet both of those needs in one felt swoop, and it's a great active learning strategy. I use this one a lot. Megan, next slide, please. So Jigsaw, I think, is one that is near and dear to both Megan and my hearts, but it requires a lot of work from the instructor standpoint. So this is if you've got a lot of classroom time and you've got a lot of time to plan, then I think we could do a Jigsaw. It's a little tricky if you're short on time, both in class and prep time for yourself. So essentially a Jigsaw is having students explore a resource or tools in small groups rather than you're standing at the front and presenting it to them. You're asking them to dig into it. And the level of scaffolding of that exploration is up to you. So I've done it where I've just like given students a resource and been like, go in there and play around and see what you can do, what you can find, and then we'll talk about it. Or I've provided guided questions to either like really walk them step by step, click this button, select this drop down, go to this next page. Depends on the audience, the level of your audience, the assignment, the time that you have, right? How you scaffold that. And then the small groups will then present out to the larger group the tips and tricks and tools that they learn. So it allows the student to become the teacher. They get to step to the front of the room if it's in a physical classroom, or to the top of your Zoom screen if you're doing it virtually. And I think that's a really great way of, again, helping them build that knowledge. I've had to engage with this in some way, whether it's either very scaffolded and I've had a lot of teacher support, or I'm just learning it myself. And then I'm learning from you as a peer. It's a really, very, very cool activity. But as I said, it does take a lot of time, particularly if the tool is complex and you need to write out a lot of documentation to get the students to the place that they need to get. That's time for you. And so weigh that cost benefit analysis, right? But I think it's really great to every time you get students the opportunity to learn from one another in that peer-to-peer learning piece and give them feeling like they are the authority at the front of the classroom. I think that, again, that adds to that feeling of belonging in your classroom and the excitement around active learning. So Megan, next slide. So there's so many active learning strategies. This is like the quickie list, right? We give you 3 sort of more in-depth versions. This is our kind of our highlights. Concept mapping, which I know Megan is going to talk about in her example, so she'll give you an example of using that. Games like Jeopardy or Bingo can be really engaging. I've seen a lot of cool Jeopardy games that I wish I had time to build for my ed students. I love a Jeopardy game. Even something as having students work on their own topics or with their own data sets, whether that's individually or a group, they're engaging in work and using the tool and figuring it out rather than I'm at the front clicking through each of the menu options, right? That's deadly from the student perspective. So giving them a chance to work on their own work or having them work on a shared problem or case study, again, in small groups or the whole class. Those second 2 really tie back to the idea that the learning is personal and contextual, right? It needs to matter to me for me to engage in it fully. So just being mindful of if you have to provide data to your students to be effective in the classroom, making sure that data is something that is understandable to them and useful to them and tied to their lived experience or their work context, right? I think that's another tip, is just thinking through what connections can I build between the things that I'm offering in support in my classroom and the things that students are engaging with is another strong connection point to make it personal and meaningful for them. So next slide, Megan, I'm turning it over to you. I'm going to take a sip of water.
I'm going to get into some examples in a moment, but I just want to share that generally, I find that preparing to embed active learning into your classes or sessions takes a lot of prep. It takes more time to plan a class that has these activities embedded in it than it does to just plan to deliver content, in a one directional thing to students. But like the delightful thing is you do all this work up front and then you sort of get into the class and you have like these moments where you can kind of chill, like the students are running the show, you've got everything already planned, so you just sort of get to ride the work you did before the class and let the students shape the content of the course. And so I've found that as a teacher to be really refreshing and more relaxing. And as someone who has always gotten very stressed out about talking to people in front of a room, like it really transformed me as a teacher in the library classroom, and I felt liberated in many ways. And like I said, a little bit more relaxed. I think it's easier in the actual session. So Diane has walked through a number of active learning strategies, but one distinction I want to make here is that when you select a strategy, you typically then need to also select some sort of like a tool to deliver the activity or structure the activity in some way. And so there are a lot of those out there too, just like there are a lot of active learning strategies. There are a lot of ways that you can then like make that happen in the classroom to sort of varying technical degrees. So first, data visualization tools is an obvious one for all of you. You sort of have these embedded active learning tools that are probably pretty obvious ways that you can integrate these strategies into your classroom. We are using Mentimeter today. I love Mentimeter. I use it all the time. It's a great alternative to clickers, which I think are terrible and expensive. It is Mentimeter. There is a free version of it. I think it allows you to do up to 5 interactive slides. It's not great. My library has an institutional, or not, we purchased 10 seats into Mentimeter, and the University of New Hampshire library is not rich. We don't have a lot of extra stuff. So I think it's just like a couple $100 a year or something to get those seats. And we've found it enormously beneficial for our teaching. And it's just a really easy way to create flexibility in active learning environments when, you might have to toggle to remote because of COVID, for example. It allows you to do that very easily because you can do this in person. You can still use a Mentimeter, or it works great over Zoom as well. You can also create Mentimeters that are sort of just open. People can go into them and do discussions and respond to the questions in them at any time at their own pace. And that data gets captured in the slide in an ongoing way. So some very cool tools in that. I use Google Drive all the time in my teaching. So Google Docs, Google Slides, Google Sheets. One of the types of documents that you can create in Google Drive is a Jamboard, though a lot of people don't know about it because it's like further down the list. I love Jamboards. I'm like a little bit crazy about them. It's basically a tool where you can create an online whiteboard. So they're very ephemeral, like people can just get into them and change them and mark them up. And before the pandemic, where I was pretty much only teaching face-to-face, I really loved using like papers and markers and giving students scissors and Post-its in the classroom. And so when that was taken away from me, it was very like alarming, but I've found that Jamboard has been a really great tool to use to sort of replicate that hands-on construction of some sort of learning object within the classroom. And it also, when you're embedding an online tool to facilitate your active learning activity, you then are capturing information about what the students did that you can go back to and refer to later. So those are all good ones. Phones, most of our students have smartphones now. I often ask them to do some quick activities where maybe they even leave the classroom and they take a photo of something that they find confusing in the library, or even a video. And so that's an easy thing that you can bring into the classroom as well. Padlet is an online corkboard. I don't use it a lot because I like Jamboard so much, but a lot of people really like Padlet. I find it's difficult to get, if I can use Google tools, I'll do that. We're not even a Google school. I'm just using free Google tools, but students are so familiar with it that it's like there's less of like a technical issue than there might be if you're going outside of that. Zoom breakout rooms. If you're on a Zoom, like breakout rooms are a great way to facilitate discussions and group conversations. But I would say something I didn't put on this slide, that in the physical classroom, like thinking about how you're setting up your classroom can be very important for how you're facilitating active learning. And I already mentioned this a little bit, but I really just love to like make a craft sesh, you know, and like let students have at it and see what they do. So don't forget about sort of those lo-fi tools that you can use with in the classroom. So I want to walk through some specific examples from my teaching, and I'll make notes about the learning outcomes, my active learning strategy, and my tool. I know many of you work at different types of institutions, so I just want to acknowledge that I'm showing examples that are very sciencey and very academic library focused, and you know that sort of is what it is. That's what I do. But I hope that they are generalizable enough that you can apply them in different contexts. So this first example is a class that I teach each fall for an upper level natural resources class. The topic map or concept map that's pictured here on the slide is one that I created for the students to use as an example. I am not sharing any student work today. I don't have permission to do that. Even though I have many wonderful examples of student work, I think it's important for us as professionals to recognize their ownership of their own learning content. But this is a topic map that I created as an example. The students actually are always better than mine are. But example topic of diet and winter foraging behavior of the red fox, and I did this in Jamboard. So the group of students that I'm working with here are in the early stages of a group research proposal for a wildlife monitoring class. Students in this session are asked to briefly describe their topic at the center of the slide here, and then map out all the questions they will need to research around their topic. So they're doing things like identifying stakeholders, considering different perspectives and disciplinary lenses. I prompt them to sort of ask their research questions in new ways, explore different sub-research questions. Start to then, after they build out their initial concept map, I really push them to start then creating a bridge between, you know, here's the question I have, here's what I need to learn more about, but what are then the information formats that exist that might contain that information, and what are my strategies for seeking that type of format. And often students sort of end up shaping this concept map into sort of a research plan for their projects. I find I love topic maps, concept maps. I use them all the time. It's really a go-to for me. I think it really helps students refine their research questions in a hands-on and visual way. It allows them to explore underrepresented perspectives and identify underrepresented formats of information that may represent those perspectives, but also identify, I think, gaps in the research and silences in the data. So looking at sort of what's not asked in the conversation around this topic. The second example is a session I taught this semester for a pre-college program. So it's like right before the fall semester starts. There's a group of students that comes in for sort of a little like college prep week, and they have a library session as part of that. And it's meant to be a jump start, and definitely my active learning approach here is really meant to mostly like let them know that I'm friendly and that I exist and that, you know, I'm not scary. So I try to make this session more fun. And so here I've used Mentimeter to create a choose your own adventure activity. So students, there were like 15 different 3 different groups of these 5 sets of prompts, but I just let the students choose whatever they want to do, and then they sort of report back things that were challenges or confusing, and it's fun. It's kind of surprising to see what directions these things take, and also is like for those of us who think about usability and user experience in libraries is a great way to do a little usability study on your library as well. This example, graduate students in a nutrition and dietetics who have they're very new to grad school. They just started and they haven't really settled into their area of research yet. They're not like at the master's thesis proposal stage at all. So that's an important thing to think about. Like, is this group of students coming into your classroom already having like a defined research topic or project that they're working on, or do you need to give them something to work with? Because trust me, I've made this mistake. It's like really awkward to just like start saying like, well, just make up a topic that you're interested in and go do it. Like that's a great way to get like deer in the headlights, blank stares, and silence in your classroom. So in this session, this is actually one of my very favorite activities I've ever done, but I do have a significant chunk of time to work through this. I think the class is usually almost 2.5 hours long, but the students are given a sort of a sensational news story. There's a lot of those in nutrition in the popular press, and they critique the claims made in that article. And then in groups, they track back the claims to research studies and then begin to synthesize the evidence around the research questions that emerge from that examination. They make recommendations for their own clinical practice. And it's sort of a quick in-depth dive into how nutrition information gets communicated, but also how critiquing, it's also a way for them to critique how nutrition misinformation spreads among consumers. And you'll see that there's this like poster template. That really fun part of this activity is this is a Google slide template that I just give the students. And I tell them like, this is just sort of like the general structure for what I'd like you to do, but they make poster presentations and present them to the class on this topic. And they never look like this boring template. Like they go nuts, and it's so fun and awesome. And like compared to, I think, poster presentations in like the normal classroom, which end up being so scary and anxiety inducing for students, like, it's just like, this doesn't matter. We all know you just started working on this. And so it's also a great like way that you can allow students some time to practice some of their, or maybe even feel more ease as they practice some of their presentation skills in a low stakes environment.
So Megan, I hate to interrupt. I just wanted to call your attention to the time. We're getting about 12 minutes before we are going to have a break.
Got it. Thank you. I think I'm on track. So example number 4 here, this is an animal science course for first-year students. They have an assignment called a label challenge, where they have to examine a food label and draw connections to animal systems. So in this class, I use Mentimeter, and I also developed sort of pre-class course modules that are embedded within the learning management system that's used in the class. And so the content for the modules and discussion questions in the class really aim to look critically at the regulation of food chains and the industrial agriculture environment that we all experience, and the human health ramifications of that. So the discussion prompts and search examples really try to examine, in particular, corporate interest in food labeling and consumer marketing, and dig into that a bit. So I go through my own example, and sort of part of embedding some of the critical practices that aren't necessarily like a huge slap in the face all the time, but sometimes it's just a way of like shaping the questions that you're asking of students. Example number 5 here, an upper level sustainability course. These students are, instead of sort of making a LibGuide for this course, and burn your LibGuides, I don't like LibGuides. I just find them to be time consuming and difficult to maintain. I often ask students to create collaborative research guides in Google Docs. So I usually create some sort of structure for the guide and include a few resources to get students started. But I ask students to build the rest, and it's a tool that they can continue to use throughout the semester. This approach, I think, it allows students to engage really deeply in the review and selection of content on the guide, and build knowledge around their research process with their peers. So big picture, that's really what it's about for me. So giving the classroom over to the students, that is core for me of what active learning is. And really what critical pedagogy is, which I'll get into in a moment, is that you take your power and you give it away. Just quickly, I attended a data visualization webinar last year through the National Library of Medicine, facilitated by Dr. Raul Bargava at Northwestern, and who's the co-founder of the Data Culture Project. So in the webinar, participants were given some data about ice cream consumption and consumer preferences, and then asked to gather just the objects they had around their desk to create visualizations about some aspect of the data, and then upload pictures of what they created into an open Google folder. And I think in data visualization, students may expect that they need tech skills. They may find that intimidating. And so I just loved like how low stakes this method was. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about critical pedagogy and critical data literacies. So critical pedagogy is a teaching philosophy that invites educators to encourage students to critique structures of power and oppression. It is both a theory and a method of practice that invites students to think critically about historical, social, and political power as part of their learning. So there are several flavors of critical pedagogy that have sort of emerged over the decades. You'll hear things like critically responsive, critically relevant, culturally responsive, culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogy are some ones that are really talked about a lot right now. This graphic is titled Critical Cultural Literacy, and it's from an article that came out just a couple of weeks ago by Dr. Nicole Cook for Project Information Literacy. I recommend you checking it out. It's great. But it illustrates the way that multiple literacies work together to assemble what is a critical literacy, which is almost, you need all these things to get to that. So all of this theory can really, I think, feel like a lot, but you can embed critical practices, as I already mentioned a little bit, into your teaching in small ways to start. So how do you frame your questions to students? How do you push them to consider their research questions in different ways or through different lenses? So as a science librarian, I'd like to dive a little deeper into how I talk about criticality in the STEM classroom. So please, again, excuse the science focus here for the next few slides, but I hope it's translatable into sort of social science and humanities context or others as well. So here is a pretty classic representation of the scientific research process, which unsurprisingly is a big part of information literacy instruction in the sciences, right? So in her book, Disordered Cosmos, Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, who's a cosmologist at the university where I work, she describes two theoretical frameworks through which we define the scientific process. The first is internal science. So this is the most common framing. It considers science to be objective and isolated from social and political influences in the outside world. We are taught that the scientific process equals built-in objectivity. So this is probably how most of us were taught to do science. The second framing is external science, which considers the socio-political context in which science is designed and produced. So that probably sounds a little bit familiar. External science, I would argue, is sort of a critical framing of the scientific process. So Prescott-Weinstein points out that we are rarely taught the difference between these two approaches, and even told that we are, rarely are we even told that we're using internal science, because science, really by design, is subject to the same power structures that undergird all the things in our society. So not identifying those forces keeps things as they are. So we as librarians have an opportunity, I think, to really pull back the curtain on this, on science, and reveal how it is external. And the context of science, is revealed through information, right? So finding data silences, for example, which I mentioned earlier, is an information practice that we can help students develop. So perhaps this may feel a little bit like an inappropriate assertion of one's political, social, or cultural worldview. I sometimes hear, but when those of us at public universities that particularly are often encouraged to be apolitical or neutral, I know that's a conversation I've heard from leaders at universities before. But this approach is not any more or less of an agenda than not doing so, which serves really through silence to reinforce internal science and the status quo. So just digging a little bit more into specifically into bias. So how do we talk about bias in the library classroom? Often it's narrowly addressed as implicit or explicit bias of the researcher on the individual level. And I believe this is flawed because it neglects to recognize how individualized bias is shaped by institutionalized power. So more specifically, how bias comes into science, we can talk about it as reporting. So what's of value in our tenure system in academia? It's not reporting negative results. People don't do that. And so that's an individual sort of bias in practice, but it's one that's a result of the system. Our analytical methods, techniques, equipment, instruments, they all influence the data that exists. Funding, what is even seen to have value in given money, and discovery and access, thinking about who is able to find and access this research that we're producing. So it's human decisions and systems that influence the data and the algorithms and the research questions that are even asked or noticed. So I just want to point to a couple of examples that I've used in the classroom to point back to the external aspects of science. So as just an example, centering the sort of the symptoms, the research around heart attack and stroke was long done on men only. And so the recommendations about how to recognize a stroke or a heart attack didn't work for women for a very long time. There's an absence in the literature about the health impacts of herbicides and pesticides on farm workers. Most of it relates to sort of the consumer level impact of exposure to pesticides and herbicides. So, and those farm workers are disproportionately migrant or undocumented laborers. And so what does that mean? How can we point out those issues within the research landscape? There's a number of studies, even recent ones in the medical literature, that attempt to identify a correlation between Black Americans and the predisposition to asthma, when there is a wealth of evidence that indicates that racist housing and environmental policies have meant that Black Americans are more likely to live in polluted communities. And I don't think I have to talk much about that. Research on gun violence is minimally funded because of the influence of the NRA on all of our legislative levels. So what I really want to say about this, and I promise, Dan, I'm wrapping up quickly here. I might run 2 minutes over, but bear with me, please. This is important, so we'll adjust everything. So what does it mean when STEM environments are toxic for many people, right? What does it mean for science? So recent examples from my institution. A white male chemistry professor was pretending to be a woman of color on Twitter and posting offensive tweets and trolling women scientists of color. Last year he was put on administrative leave as a result. But that's one thing that popped up that's a screenshot from a local newspaper. And then just last week, Vice News published an article about a biologist, Dan Howard, who I have worked with for many years. They exposed that he was guilty of sexual assault and misconduct at his previous institution, which was unreported under Title IX. And it has emerged that he has been sexually assaulting students in the field while he's out doing field work while at the University of New Hampshire. So, what does this mean when science exists in this space? It means, first of all, that I'm really, really sad and mad, and that I'm sure many of you all feel the same, but that last news story really hit home for me and made me sort of filter some of my thoughts about how to approach this presentation, definitely. And it means that, talking about science under that internal framework, isolated, assuming that it's objective, I think is just wrong when we're existing in this space. So people and their identities, Black and brown people, disabled people, trans people have to deal with toxic marginalization to greater or lesser extents while they participate in science, and that matters. So some sort of like on the ground things here. In data literacy, like the broader category of information literacy, we really aim to help students learn to find, use, and organize, analyze, evaluate data, right? So specifically related to visualization, students need to think about how they want to represent data to someone else to understand, for that person to understand. So, what's the story and how will you communicate that? So with that, how do we do critical data instruction? A few ideas that I'd like to suggest to all of you. I think you can use sort of conscious raising examples, particularly when students aren't already working with their own data or don't have a topic. So, pick what's the data set you're going to provide to them. Pick, gender wage gap data and throw it at them, see what they do with it. Guided questions about the production of scholarly information related to audience authority and accessibility, I think can help illuminate profit structures and their impact on information environments. Asking students to, in exploring citation practices, and I think this includes data citation practices. I think there's some things that you can do to get to not just the how to create citations, but the why. And one thing that I've done before is ask students to create a photo bibliography where they find photos of the scholars that they are citing and put them next to the citation. And so you can see their visible identity. And it tends to be sort of revealing about who's represented in scholarly communities. And, investigating data provenance and understanding, where it comes from and like what are the influences to sort of how that data is produced. So in sum, my friends, every day is bring your values to work day. Don't be left out. Push that agenda like you'll be okay. It's just part of the work that we're doing. So let's go. And what I mean by let's go to break. So we have a 40-minute break and we'll just shift sort of everything back a little bit and Diane and I will figure things out. So we're planning to give you 40 minutes right now. And for either afternoon, for lunch, for those of you on Pacific time, or afternoon snacks for those of you in other places. And when we come back, we will be working on identifying an active learning strategy and tool that you'd like to try out and plan for. So be ready for that.
All right, y'all. I think it's been our 40-minute break. Don't trust us to tell you what time it is. Time is a flat circle, but I think you've had 40 minutes to stretch and eat. And for our folks on the West Coast, I hope you all had lunch. I know it's kind of a funny long break for people on the East Coast, but we want to make sure that everybody is fed and happy and feeling good. I had some water. I had some leftover Halloween candy. I'm ready to like rock the second half of this workshop. So I hope maybe you're hearing my voice from a distant part of your Zoom zone and you're coming back to us. So I want to say thank you also to Megan. That was some fire at the end of the section before we went into break. So thank you for bringing that pedagogical thunder to our workshop. I appreciate you so much. That was wonderful. So I hope you all have had time to marinate on what Megan talked about, both the examples she shared of her active learning, the way she's incorporating critical pedagogy into her classroom, and think about perhaps ways you may want to infuse criticality into your own work. And so funnily enough, we're starting off the second half of this workshop with a little time again for you to work independently. I know we just like sent you off to have your own time, but we want to make sure we give you that independent work time as well. So if you all wouldn't mind getting back into those workbooks that we use to rate our learning outcomes, and you will find a section for active learning. And so we're going to give you, I would say, again, I'm like 5 to 7 to 10-ish minutes, right? Some flexible time to identify an active learning strategy you might want to employ based on the learning outcomes you identified in the first half. And if you want to take some time to tweak those learning outcomes, that's also, we get it, right? Like take a time to adjust those learning outcomes as necessary. And again, when we ask you to share with the learning outcomes, we're going to ask you to share an active learning strategy that you might employ on a Menti on the next slide. So feel free to keep your video muted or mute your video if your video is still live, and take a few minutes to work on your active learning strategy. Okay, everybody, if you could give me either like a thumbs up on your Zoom reactions, or just a note in the chat to let me know that you feel like you've had enough time to work on your active learning strategy and you're ready to move on, that would be awesome. Okay, see some thumbs up reactions. Thank you, thank you. Awesome. All right, we appreciate you. Thank you so much. So if you took a look at the chat, I told a little fib. I thought we had a Menti in here, and we took one out because we thought it was too much. So just kidding. You're going to keep those active learning strategies close to your heart for now. We're going to do a little pivot and talk about assessment. So there will be a Menti coming soon. Don't you worry. We want to hear about that participation. So assessment is a tricky topic, and Megan and I spent a lot of time talking about how we wanted to address assessment in the context of our conversation today. So please know that we're not coming to you with answers. We have as many questions as you do, and we want to make space to sort of discuss the questions that we share. So as we know, standalone workshops, we have a limited amount of time to teach folks, and we have a limited amount of content that we can pack into those minutes, right? So I've truly been asked to do 15 to 20 minutes in a session. I've been asked to do a 45-minute session, and trying to assess a 15 to 20-minute learning opportunity is really, really, really hard. We know assessment will take time away from our teaching. We know students are not going to complete assessments outside of course time. So I think we've all had the experience of trying to build like a beautiful survey, and we're going to give that survey at the end in class, and then we have too much content and we push the survey out to our students, and then maybe like one do good friend like fills it out, and we're so grateful for them, but we just know that if it doesn't happen in the classroom, it's gonna be really hard to capture evidence of that learning. Defining your learning outcomes with measurability in mind helps so much, right? We're relying on those Bloom's taxonomy words. If I'm asking you to define, if I'm asking you to identify, I'm asking you to analyze, describe, that can help us bake in assessment right off the bat. And ensuring that like as we're designing our active learning strategy, we have assessment in the back of our mind, that also helps, right? Like merging those two things together to make assessment as integrated into our lesson as possible is what's going to give us the most benefit. So there's a couple of sort of actionable strategies in here, but I think the tension that we feel as folks who do teaching is that there's assessment of student learning, which is sort of one bucket of assessment. There's assessment of our teaching, which is a second sort of bucket of things. And then there's this idea of library impact. So I don't know about y'all, we hear this a lot in our institutions around how is your teaching providing impact to the institution, to our library, to our after school community, whatever context you're teaching in. And I think none of those buckets are going to be realistically assessed in a 45-minute, a 30-minute, an hour workshop, right? So I'm sure you will all take something away, for example, from today's work. But if I gave you a quiz on the constructivism in 4 months, would you be able to tell me exactly what you tell me at the end of this workshop? Probably not, right? So learning takes time, it takes repetition, it takes repeat engagement. And it's really tricky to get meaningful assessment of our student learning, of our teaching, right? A lot of things are happening with our students. We had some conversation earlier in the chat about students not participating or not feeling motivated in terms of our lesson. Some of that's in our control, some of that's not in our control. We are all operating in a global pandemic, right? So am I bringing my best self to this workshop? I'm trying, but I'm probably not working at the capacity that I was working 3 years ago, right? And then the other added layer is that institutional assessment piece, right? So how much value is my 15 minutes bringing to the institution? Am I asking to be measuring like how many people are in attendance, how many questions I was asked? Does that tie it all to my student learning? It's really fuzzy and tricky and complicated. So we don't have answers here, but we would love to hear some of your thoughts. So Megan, why don't we go ahead and pull up the next Menti? So this is a two-parter Menti that we're asking you to engage with here. And the first question we're asking you, you should have a slider on your Menti screen. At your workplace, what are your institutional assessment needs? So what is your institution hoping that you're going to assess at the end of your workshop, at the end of your sessions? And if you have an other, there's not an open text box to put that on this particular on screen, but go ahead and indicate how important or not important that other is. And if you could put the other text itself in the chat box, so we can all see what is outside of this idea of either number of workshops or classes, number of students, library use, very squishy, right? Student metrics and student learning. We'd love to hear what your institution is hoping you'll be assessing as part of your work. Yes, Andy says this is a good question. I feel like I'm unclear. I also have felt that way, right? I'm not always 100% clear on what the institutional priorities are and how does that tie into my teaching. Thanks for sharing that, Andy. I appreciate that. It looks like we have a lot of number of workshops equals better. Number of, as Megan and I say, butts and seats is better. The more butts and seats you could get, the better job that you're doing. Our student learning at like 5 crushing, right? As people who are really trying to be thoughtful and design active learning and apply good pedagogy and try to reach that praxis, right? That meaning of theory and practice to get there. Woof. Yes, Ellie, great point. So some of it is that we do have to collect that NAICS data. That is important. There's stuff that we have to institutionally report. And I think you're right that there's a difference between what we have to mandated report and then what value we're drawing from that. And I think sometimes we get mixed messages at the institutional level between like, we need this to do this for a report versus we think this is what reflects positively on you as an educator. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so it looks like we have 16 people have filled this out. So Megan, can we click through to our next one? So, whoop. It's happening live. Okay, here we go. All right, so now this is another set of sliders. Now, what's interesting? What are you most interested in assessing for your own practice, right? Outside of what your institution is pressuring you to do or not do, what is of most interest to you as an educator in your classroom? And if there's something that didn't make it to the slider, right? We picked 4 things that felt meaningful to us. Please feel free in the chat to articulate other things that you'd like to assess from the teaching perspective. Yes, Justin, the pressure to just assess something, right? Anything, if you can do just anything. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Emma, thanks. Something that's interesting to Emma is the data preparedness of their students. Thank you for sharing that. Other stuff that didn't make it to our list, please pop that in the chat so we can all see.
I find where this is all landing to be very hilarious because it looks like everything's important. Yeah. So we have to, teasing out those priorities is fun.
Yes, tens across the board here. So because this is a really thorny topic, I would invite folks to unmute if there's something you want to share or discuss or open to the floor around this tension between what's meaningful to me to assess as an educator versus what my institution is asking me to assess versus like how am I even going to assess anything when I have 20 minutes to 30 minutes to try to teach something? I would love to open the floor just for a few minutes if folks have things that they want to chat about, because this, like I said, Megan and I are not coming to this with like a beautifully packaged idea to hand to you with all the solutions. We'd love to hear your questions or comments or concerns while we're here together in a space with people doing similar work.
Well, I have to say, I don't really care about long-term retention of skills at the level I'm teaching usually. If I'm teaching graduate students, maybe I do, but I mean, if they can ask for help and I'm an effective teacher, those two should cover my bases.
Yeah, thank you, Ellie. I've often found that my key piece that I want my students to retain is that they know that they have a kind, friendly person to come and ask for help. And if you don't remember what a subject heading is or which drop down to check in the tool, like that's okay, as long as you know that there's somebody who's there who could help you and is excited to support you 100%. Anybody else have some thoughts or questions that they'd like to pose to the group around this challenge of assessment?
I have a kind of a question about, I guess one of the difficulties that I've been experiencing is the push for asynchronous content. And so the difficulty when it comes to assessment of that, unless it's, you create a YouTube video and how many people viewed it, that's really at some point the only assessment we can have, or finding out if instructors are using the videos. And so I feel like we're getting a lot more pressure to create asynchronous content, but it's difficult to measure to assess it in any ways, to measure the effectiveness and basically like all of the different assessment outcomes that were listed. It's very difficult to assess that. And I don't know if there are any other better strategies besides just trying to like survey instructors to see if they're using it, and, or looking at your views.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Megan, I see you're unmuted. Do you have thoughts to share with Ashley?
Well, I was just thinking, like, one thing that I've done with some asynchronous stuff is to embed even like kind of silly little quizzes and stuff. And if it's something you're building in a learning management system, that there's tools for that. And then I mentioned that with Menti, you can have mentees that are audience driven. So I'm advancing these slides and you can't move through them on your own the way I have it set up, but you can set them up so people can do this on their own. And then you can you might be able to capture some, see how students are answering some of the questions related to your content as well, can be one way, but it's definitely not going to answer all the assessment questions. It's really tough. And generally, like, I find the tension between these two questions, the like institutional pressures and like what I'm interested in, don't align particularly well. And that the people who I'm accountable to, who are asking me to assess my teaching, don't understand teaching or maybe even assessment. And so I'm often being asked to, in the situation that you're referring to, like you feel like you're being asked to assess something and create this story about the meaning in that assessment without that really being realistic or possible. It's tough.
Any other thoughts before we talk a little bit about preparing for the assessment that we do have time to do, or space to do, or inclination to do in our workshops? Ellie, great question. Are numbers of classes and students even assessment? It depends on what your definition of assessment is. To me, it doesn't matter how many butts are in the room, but rather, like, am I being an effective teacher? Are my students coming away with skills and resources that they will find helpful for their learning? Yeah, I think my institution likes to see numbers as assessment, but you're right that that's not necessarily the same thing.
Oh my gosh, and I just thought it was Backwater, Idaho.
It is not, my friend.
I'm kind of kidding.
we're the same soup. Angela, I see you've unmuted. You have something you'd like to share?
Yeah, I might be able to hopefully frame this in a way that's just quick, but I'm a little curious how other people are reading teaching effectiveness such that it doesn't like encompass these other things. Like, what outside of kind of long-term retention of skills comfort seeking help, learning outcomes, do you consider teaching effectiveness? And maybe that's a question for you, Diane. But
yeah, so my distinction between these two things is because I know I have such a limited time to assess my student learning, I'm seeing them as rather than I'm focusing on how I taught it, I want to know, did my students retain what I had hoped they would retain? And then part of my reflection, which we'll talk about later after my teaching, that's when I try to dig into the teacher effectiveness piece. And sometimes I can get them both in one shot, but it's not always that I didn't teach it well is why they didn't retain it, right? Like there could be, again, these other mitigating factors. Was it raining that day? Was it 8:30 in the morning and they were freshmen and everybody was in their pajamas and they were exhausted, right? Like there can be other mitigating factors that it's important for me to keep track of in my teacher reflection versus necessarily what they learned in the room. But that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. That's great. All right, friends, we're gonna keep on trucking. Megan, if you could pull up our next slide, please. So when we're preparing for assessment and whatever assessment means to us in this moment, right? Like hold on to that. Here are some things to think about as we're making sure that we're getting ready to do that. Looking at our learning outcomes, what are our key questions that we want to answer? And if we've written our learning outcomes effectively, the assessment is going to be so much easier, right? Leaning so heavily on our Bloom's taxonomy, getting those verbs that are easy to assess. Can we capture any evidence of our student work, ideally in our session, right? We know they're not necessarily going to follow up with us outside of that. And then I probably should have swapped these bullet points, but are there any student privacy concerns to consider? So I really appreciated Megan's comment about having a wealth of student work that she has captured for her assessment, but that she's not going to share it with us today, right? Because that's a privacy issue. So just being mindful of that as we're asking students to give us stuff, how we store it, what we then do with it. And you all are data people, so I know you know that, but I just have to underscore it here. Are there opportunities for longer term follow-up with the students? If we're in a higher ed context, can we follow up with the faculty? Can we see if, you know, the stuff we taught them ended up in their final projects and their final papers? Is there space to do some follow-up there? And then we want to make sure that we're tying our assessment directly back to that active learning strategy that we picked. So again, just to underscore the importance of the active learning technique is means to an end, right? We don't want to pick it just because it's fun and it's exciting and we're bored with how we've been teaching. We want to make sure it's tied to those learning outcomes, and that learning outcomes are going to be tied to our assessment, and that's going to help us understand if we did what we said we were going to do when we welcomed our students into our classroom and into our space. So in your workbooks, there is space to look at some assessment ideas that we've just like really simple stuff we pulled together. There's a couple of links for more what they call CATs, classroom assessment techniques that may be useful to you. We're not going to give you space to do that right now because again, we have so much content, and as we've discussed, it's a really thorny, complicated thing. So rather than working on that right this moment, that's for you to do at your leisure. But we are in the next section. Megan, if you could bring us up our next slide here. We're going to give you some time to chat with some of your colleagues, right? So if you want to talk about assessment in this time, that is a totally awesome use of your time. Please be encouraged to do that. You don't have to. We wanted to give you the opportunity to sort of chat through this whole lesson plan experience. What have we come up with so far? What has been most useful for us? Megan has a set of questions that she's going to put in the chat for us to help guide and shape your time together if you feel like you need something a little more structured. So we're asking you to talk about what are your learning outcomes? What active learning strategy are you planning to use? What tools will you use to facilitate that activity, right? Our tools and our active learning strategy, not the same thing, two discrete things to think about. What's important for you to assess, right? Not necessarily what assessment are you going to use, but what's important for you to assess as the leader of the workshop. And then what's one challenge that you anticipate, right? So I think we learn a lot when we're hearing about what people are hopeful to do and aiming to do and their experience, but I think we also learn a lot by thinking through what are those challenges we might face when we're in that space. So we are going to create some breakout rooms. Megan, I don't know if you were already on that. Oh, you're muted.
I am. I'm just shuffling a couple of things around.
Okay, sorting people out. So in mere moments, we are going to send you into a breakout room with somebody to chat with these questions. They're in the chat so that you'll have them. You'll have access to the chat when you're in the breakout room. And we just want to give you some space to meet with a colleague and chat. Oh, I heard some great convos. It was so fun. Everybody was like talking about cool stuff.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Great. I think we got into everybody's room, Diane. I saw you were in 4 and I made it to 3.
Yes. That was a good like top down, bottom up, stick your nose in breakout room strategy. Let's see. So do we have everybody back now? Yes, I think so, right?
Yeah, or at least nobody is in a breakout room.
Nobody's in the breakout room. Okay, some people may need a break from the room and are taking that. That's great. Okay, so if you are back here with us, thank you for hanging in. We would love you again. Hop on that Menti and share one cool thing about your partner's lesson plan. And if you didn't get into the nitty gritty of your lesson plans, I know some folks are talking about challenges and folks are talking about assessment. We were doing all kinds of cool conversation. Give us a little taste of what your partner was working on, just so we can see across the rooms what people were talking about. Ooh, so creating a particular, like, doing your own little misinformation. That's fascinating, rather than like try to identify what the misinformation or misrepresentation is, but like create it on your own. Very cool. So a small group context, digging into the same data sets. What conclusions are we drawing that's different or the same from each other's? Ooh, a code along tool, right on. We love a think, pair, share. I tell you, think, pair, share is what I go back on. If I'm not sure, put in a think, pair, share. It's great. Jamboards, yeah. Ooh, a paired programming structure, cool.
That the one about the lesson plan exploring different types of open data portals and asking questions of them is a great example of something that might fit for a Jigsaw, I think. So assigning a data portal to each group and then having them present that back. It's really cool.
Oh, they're planning on a Jigsaw. Right on. We love a Jigsaw for open data portal friend. Awesome. Oh, yes. Okay. What choices they make in the programming and what choices, in quotes, the program itself is making. So important to make those distinctions, right? What's being decided for you and what does that mean for your final product? Right on. Well, these are great. All right, so like one more minute here. If you're frantically typing your cool thing, now is the time to put the cool thing in there before we move on to the next section of our content. I want to say I appreciate the conversations I got to pop into. Thank you all for welcoming me into your breakout rooms. I was so impressed with the types of things you were talking about. I'm glad that time was useful for y'all to connect with one another and share practitioner to practitioner. So thank you for engaging and thank you for being so welcoming to Megan and myself. That was awesome. So, all right, Megan, I think we're ready to keep on trucking, folks. And thanks for sharing on the Menti, right? That allows us to share with your folks that had to drop off for various reasons and give you a chance to, again, do that peer-to-peer connection stuff. So we're going to do a little like pivot here into classroom management. So classroom management is a topic that is admittedly near and dear to my heart. I think it's because I come from an early childhood and an elementary education background, and like classroom management looks very different when there's, you know, a room full of 3-year-olds versus a room full of graduate students. So for whatever reason, I've held that close to my heart. And I think that part of effective classroom management is planning ahead, right? There are things we can control in advance and things we can control in our lesson that makes things easier for us. And the second half is really thinking on your feet, right? So there will be moments that are going to surprise and shock and confuse you in your classroom management. And sometimes you can have a little like pre-planning and pre-thought of how I might handle this that can be helpful. And the other piece is that it does get easier the more that you do it, right? So understanding what we can control in advance is helpful. Having some back of our mind strategies for something that comes up that's unexpected is helpful. And then just like trying to roll with it in the moment and reflecting back and making changes the next time, I think is the third piece of that puzzle. So next slide, please, Megan. So one thing we can control is time management. And I struggle with time management. Megan told us she struggles with time management. I think Megan and I together in this workshop struggle with time management, right? There's so much that we want to share. I think this is true of anybody who works in the library, right? We have so many beautiful things that we want to share with you, and there just isn't time to get to it all. And especially if we're engaging with active learning, everything takes longer than we would anticipate, right? It's much easier to time yourself doing a lecture, and you can say those words in exactly 17 minutes and keep it moving. Whereas if I'm inviting my students to the front of class to share things, I'm breaking them up into small groups and they're having such a good conversation. I don't want to stop them, right? Everything takes longer than we expect. And especially if we're physically in a space and we're getting up and doing stuff, if we're sending people to breakout rooms, like building in that transition time, it eats away at the time that we have to teach our concepts. So we really want to try not to overbook ourselves. Again, really, really tricky. I know it's easy to say that, it's harder to do it in practice. And this is where those learning outcomes are really like the thing that I cling to. When I feel like I'm getting like building in too much activity, building too much tool stuff, I've got too much packed in there, I want to look back at those learning outcomes and say, okay, what do my students need to know? So Megan, next slide, please. What do my students absolutely bare minimum? We're caught in cyberspace here. What do my students need to know, and how am I prioritizing the content that I'm teaching to them, right? And that's what's going to be in those learning outcomes. If it's not in the learning outcome, right, then it's not going to make it into my lesson time, because I need to give my students space to engage with each other, with the content, with me, to have that meaningful, motivated, exciting learning experience that I'm better apt to have them learn something at the end of it than I've just timed it so that it's just me talking, and that's a more convenient thing for me. So in terms of the things we can plan for in advance with classroom management, it's much easier to time ourselves, give ourselves ample time for activities, scope our learning outcomes appropriately, right? Narrow, measurable, actionable, and that does help us get set up better for success right off the bat. The second piece there is that stuff that we need to have sort of strategies in the back of mind to employ if we're in a certain situation that can be tricky to us, and that we just sort of pre-thinking can be helpful and help us react if it's happening in the moment. So next slide, please. So we are going to do a little breakout room jam again. I know we just like chatted with people for a few minutes, but we are going to ask you to chat with some folks again. In your workbook, you have 3 classroom management scenarios. And of course, I don't have the workbook open, and I'm opening it now so that I can read those headings off to you. So there is one is about scrolling past the assessment. Okay, so one is about engagement on Zoom. One is about someone's dominating a classroom discussion. That could be either in person or virtually. And then one is about challenging experiences with faculty members in our teaching spaces. So we are going to send folks out to breakout rooms. Megan, how many rooms do we think is going to be most effective for this conversation?
I think we can do 6. So there will be 2 groups per scenario. And I'm just trying to move Aaron out. Hold on. Move. And oh, wait, hold on. We might have fewer, but that's okay if we only have one of them. So you're going to want to pay attention to your which room you're assigned to. And let's have we'll have groups 1 and 2 do scenario 1, groups 2 and 3 do scenario 2. And go ahead.
Here we go. I found it in the notes. Okay, so if you're in room 1 or 2, you're going to talk about the first scenario. If you are in room 3 or 4, you're going to talk about the second scenario. And if you are room 5 or 6, you are going to talk about our third scenario. And how are we doing on time? We're doing pretty good. So let's take 10 minutes just to chat about how we might approach this, what strategies we might use, and then we're going to ask you to come back and sort of share again in a Menti strategies that might be helpful if we encounter this in our teaching. So I think we're ready to go.
Okay, so it looks like most everybody is back in the main room now. I hope that was a fun discussion about the classroom management scenarios. We have another Menti question for you here. So share one takeaway about your classroom management discussion. And we'll give you a minute to do that.
And this is our last Menti, friends. So like, make it count. This is this is for all the marbles, our last Menti of the day. And I will also say that these classroom management scenarios were ones that Megan and I have both experienced in classroom settings. So it comes from our teaching experience, things we've run into fairly frequently. We couldn't capture all of the challenges you might face in the classroom, but we tried to pick things that were representative of frequent stuff we had run into. So scenario C was about the faculty member is interrupting and they're showing up big time in your classroom, maybe in a way that feels challenging. A or B was about different challenges with discussion, right? People are too quiet or people are over participatory. Yes, I'm seeing a lot of like diversify the ways of participation to avoid the pitfalls of the open discussion.
I like that. I like the point about how many of the, I think, active learning strategies may feel better to extroverts. One thing that I try to do to help out the introverts like myself in these types of environments is to, if possible, to, provide the discussion prompts in advance of the class so people can make some notes, or even a lot of times I use this Menti where people can just type in combination with the verbal discussion that occurs in a face-to-face class, so people can either post anonymously or speak up. And to provide some, sort of, it gets a little bit at universal design for learning, which we haven't been able to talk a lot about today, but providing many modes of participation is a great classroom management strategy and a great teaching strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll find some UDL stuff, Universal Design for Learning stuff in our recommended readings that we definitely recommend you take a look at.
Yeah, I love this too. Feel okay skipping the activity if needed. Like, I can't tell you how many times just something for whatever reason, something else happens. Like sometimes these things just crash and burn, and part of really developing confidence as a teacher, I think, is knowing that sometimes things are a disaster and just being like comfortable with that and flexible and, letting it go.
Yeah, what's in your control versus what isn't your control. You can plan your lesson, you can plan your active learning, you have control over yourself in the room, but you don't have full control over everybody else's reactions or opinions or engagement or lack of engagement. So I think, yeah, that understanding that people are messy and complicated, and sometimes our experiences are messy and complicated is so important. Yeah. Yes, I like the idea of like preamble. I was talking in one of the breakout rooms around setting expectations. We talked about how sometimes if we're doing a virtual learning opportunity and we say, okay, everybody's going to go into a breakout room, and then our numbers just tank, like what do we do then? And one of my recommendations was to set people up in advance to let them know, even if as you're marketing, or if you can send with your confirmation email of the Zoom link. But the expectation is that we're going to do some engaged participating. Like if this is not for you, I think, yeah, set that tone, be transparent about what your expectations are early, can certainly help in the long run. That's something we can prepare for versus what we have to sort of think on our feet in the classroom. And I just want to reiterate too, that it does get easier, right? The more you do it, the more comfortable you become with the messiness, the more tools you put in your teaching toolkit to redirect and gently, coax out different folks. So we don't have beautiful answers to everything in like a tried and true method. But the more you do it and the more you flex those teaching muscles, the easier these things become. All right, Megan, do you mind advancing our slides? Thank you. So we're getting towards the end here. We're taking it home, people. We're almost there. Thank you so much for hanging in. So reflection, my dear friend, reflection. So I think this is the thing that we make the least amount of time for, and it's even true for me, and I'm a reflecting evangelist, but I think it's actually the most important part of our teaching, right? This is how we become better teachers, is by making time and space for reflection. So next slide, please. So how do we build a reflective practice? Here's what we're going to do, our little like bite-size theory before we talk about the practice of doing things. This is David Kolb's learning cycle. This is from the 1980s. Since then, there have been many updated versions of reflective practices and reflecting cycles and learning cycles. But I chose the Kolb's version because I think it's really simple. And if this is new to us, it's nice to have a simple method and not, David Sean's has a lot more pieces in it and it can be a little overwhelming. So we are learners as much as we are teachers, and we're learning as we're teaching. And so having that mindset of sitting in both seats, I find helpful when I'm starting to think about reflecting. So Kolb here says we start with our concrete experience. That's our doing. That's our in the classroom. We're teaching our things. We're actualizing our active learning in the moment. Then we have a reflective observation period. So that's when we're thinking back through, how did this go? We're looking at our artifacts of student work. We're thinking about how we felt in the moment. This is where I would underscore sort of the affective dimension of teaching and learning comes in, right? This is where we get a little feelingsy. Did it feel good? Did it not feel good? Was I upset afterwards? Did I come out of there with that adrenaline rush feeling like, yes, I did the thing, right? We're working in that space. What happened? Our next piece is this abstract conceptualization. And this is where I think we pull in other people, right? So we poke our head in our colleague's office and say, oh my gosh, I just taught this learning. It was awesome. Like, we had the best workshop. My students were so engaged. I did this really cool thing. It was great. Or I'm sitting at the dinner table with my partner and I'm like, I'm the world's most terrible teacher. This, and this went wrong, right? It was, I just like need you to listen to me talk about this. And then I'm working it through in my mind, right? We're getting some conclusions. We're starting to like tie in those pieces of reflection into some actionable items. And the next step is that active experimentation, right? So we change something. Well, maybe I jammed in I tried to make those learning outcomes too big. I tried to teach too much. I ran out of time. I didn't get to the pieces I wanted to teach. Or I tried to get students to use a Jamboard and the internet crashed and it was a nightmare. And like, I got to just go back to my pens and paper that I feel much more comfortable there. And I'm getting to the same educational aims. And then we start all over again, right? We're like in the classroom again, we've made some tweaks, we're teaching it again, and we start from the beginning. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of different pieces of this that I encourage you to consider as you're reflecting and as you're thinking about your teaching. And the first is looking at that student learning piece, right? So we're reviewing any feedback we have from students, feedback from the faculty. What did they learn? What was unclear to them? What did I feel like I explained well? And sometimes that comes up in looking at student feedback, right? You can tell like you really nailed the subject heading conversation because everybody in what did they learn in their minute paper said subject headings, right? Versus they didn't learn much about selecting the right database for their research. What might I want to do differently next time, explain differently next time, organize differently next time? And I would encourage you to write this down ASAP, right? I think I get this moment of like, brain blindness approximately 15 minutes after I've walked out of my classroom or walked out of my virtual classroom and I've forgotten what those tweaks might be. So if you have a paper lesson plan or a digital lesson plan, right, like quickly noting down, like this took too long or this wasn't long enough and the students are having a great conversation, I didn't want to interrupt it. So then when the future you comes back to look at that lesson plan, you've got that note there to go ahead and make some tweaks the next time you teach the lesson. Next slide, please. So the other thing, again, getting at this affective dimension of teaching and learning, and I wish we had more time to dig into this, and it's interesting to me that like Bloom's taxonomy is only one taxonomy that they created. They created a whole affective taxonomy of teaching and learning, which I think as we see the increase of social emotional learning in schools and in different educational contexts and that being called out explicitly, we're going to come back to that affective piece. I would encourage you to start a teaching journal. And for me, this is like a little ratty notebook that I like tote around with me and clutch to my heart when I feel like I need to. And it's just a space where I reflect on how I felt in the classroom and how things went. So when was I comfortable? When did I feel like I was nailing it and things were going great? When did I feel uncomfortable? And it's important to be really honest. Like, so this is not a thing that you share with other people. This is a space just for you and your thoughts to like think through, how did this experience go? How did I feel? What felt good and bad for me? And then it allows you is to go back through and see sort of patterns in your teaching. Like I always feel the most energized when my students are really digging in a large group discussion, makes me feel like I'm doing an excellent job. Or I really feel the most uncomfortable when students are in breakout rooms. I don't have enough time to get in to see each one, and I'm concerned that people aren't getting what they need out of the session, and maybe they're just goofing off in there, right? So seeing the patterns across your teaching can help you then think about how you're doing as a teacher and how you might change and things you might want to dig into or read more about, or workshops you want to attend, or folks you want to connect with, right? You know, your colleagues does a really awesome job in creating these jigsaws, and maybe you want to talk to them about what their trick is. But having a space that you're dedicating to your teaching and a private space to really be honest and reflective, I have found to be absolutely invaluable, right? That's what helps me grow as a teacher, is keeping space for myself to think about each of these pieces outside of this context of assessment, outside of this context of institutional metrics, right? How did I feel in the moment? Because we're experiencing, you're having like real feelings and emotions, right? Your students are like struggling to learn things. They're doing this cognitive heavy lifting. Things are new to them. They're excited. They're anxious. It's hard for them, and you're feeling that too. So to make a space where you can put all that energy and then look back at it later to help you improve your practice, I think it's really invaluable. So Megan, next slide, please. So we don't have time to do this today. We've thrown so much at you in a relatively short period of time, and we really, really appreciate y'all hanging in for the ride, right? This has been a long day for everybody. But please later go back and take a look at your teaching philosophy. And I'd love you to ask yourself sort of what still rings true, right? When I wrote this before I sat down to this workshop and met these folks, what might I change based on what I learned in this workshop today, when talking with my colleagues and digging into some interesting content. And we're just remembering that we're always adding new knowledge to our mental models, right? As every time we teach, we learn something new. Every time we're in a space like this, we're learning something new. And it's keeping track of how your teaching philosophy is changed based on the things that you're learning, again, is more value add to you as a teacher, being mindful of the space that you want to create for your students, the space you want to create for yourself as a teacher and as a learner. So do please take some time, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe on Monday, to look back at that teaching philosophy and think about what you learned today and if there's things you'd like to change. So Megan, next slide.
So within your Google Drive folder, there is a resource bibliography that we've included that contains all of the resources that we've referenced today and more. We really tried to strike a balance between providing some toe dips, if you will, into educational theory and critical theory, and also really sort of like quick practical tips and tools that you can use in your everyday work. But it is by no means comprehensive. In fact, probably a little bit of random. They were things that we consulted as we were working on the content for this workshop today, or things that, you know, for me, the screenshots here on this page, these are a handful of books that have been particularly inspiring and meaningful for me in my teaching practice. So, you know, we all have to figure out individually, we can't read everything. So what are those things for you? So some of our favorites, some practical tips and tools are contained in that. And at the top of the resource list, there's a link to our Zotero group library that contains the same list of resources. But I learned from this, I use Zotero all the time, but the group libraries don't allow you to do subfolders. So they're kind of in a big dumping ground in the Zotero library, but we have them organized in the bibliography a bit more so that the practical stuff is separated from the theory stuff. Okay. So I can't believe we've made it here, but this is we do have some time for questions. And gosh, I so appreciate the energy that all of you brought to this today. It was really a delight to have space to have these conversations with you. I wish it could have been all day. And I know that it must have been particularly you know, draw on your energy resources you've been at the symposium for a couple of days and devoted a lot of time to that. So to then show up for a long workshop on the last day, kudos to you all. So thank you so much. Disordered Cosmos is not in either bibliography. How can that be?
How can that be? We will add it. We can make a tweak. Yeah.
I have it right here. I love this book. It's so good. You should read it. It's
Thank you, Angela.
Like dog-eared. It's awesome.
Thank you all. Yeah.
I will definitely make sure that gets added. I'm sorry for the oversight. Oh, and our contact information is on this slide. I will also mention that I am not territorial over my teaching materials, though, you know, I don't necessarily like polish all of them up, but I will share anything and you can borrow, repurpose, steal however you want. What's mine is yours, my friends. So if you're interested in looking at an example of how I've used Jamboards in a class, I'll send you my lesson plan and my teaching materials and all that. So definitely reach out for those sorts of things. Okay.
Awesome. So we're just seeing some like lovely, thoughtful thank yous in the chat. We appreciate you. We appreciate your thankfulness. We appreciate your time and energy. And I think if there's no other questions, we will reclaim 5 minutes of our day, unless Angela, there's something else that folks need to know before they hop off the call.
Not a thing. Thank you so much. We've heard nothing but great things from attendees, and I want to echo all of that and thank you both for the great care and depth that you were able to bring to this experience for all of us, and for your bravery in trying to condense very complex material down to just a half day. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really also just want to say thank you so much. This was fantastic. And yeah, I feel like I could have spent a bit more time even. So this was perfect. Wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Okay. Megan, are you still the host? I think send us off.
All right. Goodbye. Take care, everyone.
Bye.